Thank you. Thank you very much for the kind introduction. I'm thrilled to be here this afternoon with our partner Zscaler. We do a lot of work with Zscaler, and thrilled to be here in Edmonton to take part in the BSides discussions. When I was with the RCMP, spent a lot of time in Edmonton. K Division for RCMP, Alberta's out of Edmonton. I did ride-alongs in Grand Prairie, ride-alongs in Rainbow Lake, Alberta. It's always good to be here. And by the way, thank you for the 30 plus years of experience. I also spent my summers in Alberta growing up in the Peace River country. Anybody from Peace River country here? No, they're all still up in Peace River country. I worked for a beekeeper up there during my high school summers, which was great because that took me away from my parents and I got to do things that I just couldn't do at home. So thrilled to talk about your cyber program this afternoon. Thrilled to talk about, it doesn't matter how large, how small your organization is, you need to have a program. The size, the complexity of the program will vary. But even a startup with 2 people, laptops, cloud services, you need to know what you're going to do when things happen. So that's what we're going to talk about this afternoon. We're going to begin by talking about today's environment, cyber as a business issue. We all know it's a business issue. When I started my career, C-suite did not talk to IT folks. We couldn't and didn't speak their language. Today, it's absolutely imperative that we talk to the C-suite, that we talk to boards about our program. I'm going to talk about some threats, and I'm going to focus in on threats that we need to be aware of, and then the program, and then Ian is going to really dig deeply into zero trust. And I'm not going to read the slides. And if anybody wants to email me at the end of the presentation, in coming days, I'd be happy to share the slides with you, as well as engage in any conversations that you want to talk about. I think this is really important because we know as practitioners that people that want to do us harm may already be in our networks. They may be trolling in our networks. There may be a lot of dwell time where we don't know that they're there. And I always get worried when I walk into an organization and they tell me, we have not been had yet. We have not been compromised yet. We have not been hacked yet. And my answer to that is always, you don't have any indication today that you've been had, but maybe you have been had. And we're going to talk about that a little bit later as well. Digitization, the speed and basis of competition. We're under tremendous pressure to move forward. We're under tremendous pressure to move forward quickly and to add products, services, so on and so forth for the organization. And you can look at our roles as Chief Information Security Officers, as CIOs within organizations, and there's sometimes a little bit of a conflict between getting a product, getting a capability out to our customers, and securing that capability. And I'll tell you, when I first became Chief Information Officer of the RCMP, we of course had a lot of applications, a lot of things we were doing. By the way, anybody here from the Mounties today? Good, we can talk about them. When I first came in as CIO, you wouldn't believe how many interim authority to operates we had. What that meant was an application wasn't quite there yet, but we need to get it out, so we got interim authority to operate. But we didn't necessarily close those gaps. So that's our job, is to close those gaps and to be aware of those gaps because we're under tremendous pressure to move forward. Going to talk about some of our challenges, and you know these challenges, and you know where we are, and I'm just going to talk about a few of them. But pressure from executives, from leadership, from the board to lower costs. And by the way, I think that's a wrong answer. I think as we're moving a program forward, we've already lost if we express it in cost terms. We need, in my opinion, to express it in value and risk. So I've seen many organizations expressing their program as a cost. It's therefore a cost to the organization, and you can always lower costs. There's pressures to lower costs. We want to express our programs from a risk-based perspective, and we want to express it in language that the board can understand. Because look at your leadership and whatever construct you have, whether it's a deputy minister, a board, not-for-profit, privately owned, we need to express it in a way that our leadership understands. And by the way, then they need to accept the level of risk. It's as simple as that. And I will run across some organizations that stay as far away from the board as they can. I think you really want to get in there and talk about the program. And don't forget, the board is typically comprised of people with experience in the vertical, lawyers and accountants, not necessarily technical representation. So we've got to talk in a way that they can understand. And before I became CIO of the RCMP, I was CIO of Correctional Services Canada. And when I first came into that job, my folks told me, they don't understand us. It took a while to figure out who they were, but when they talked about they don't understand us, they talked about senior leadership. And we had not expressed the program in ways that the leadership could understand. So it was a bit of a running joke with me, but any presentation that needed to go to our board, to our commissioner, I told my folks, we've got to have it in language that my grandmother can understand. And what I meant by that was, we've got to stay away from technical terms. My grandmother at the time knew what a computer was, she knew what the internet was, she knew all these things. That's how we wanted to express it, and that's how we expressed the program, and then the business bought into it. We want to stay out of the news, that's really important. But I'll tell you, you will probably be in the news, you'll probably be in the news for a breach. What you really want is when you're in the news, when you're covered by media because of something that happened, you want them to say, oh, and by the way, they limited the damage, they fixed this, they transitioned back to operation in a matter of hours, as opposed to a matter of days, a matter of weeks. I'm not afraid of being breached. I'm more afraid if I can't respond to that breach, if I cannot transition back to operations. And that's really what we need to think of. We're going to talk a little bit about staffing, because staffing is a tremendous issue for all of us today, getting the right people on task to the right things. And what we're seeing in the industry is staffing through a number of different mechanisms, but getting the right people, training the right people, getting them on task. And I'm not necessarily going to talk about it in this slide, but we also want to talk about how do we educate our organizations about cyber. We've got Cyber Month coming up in October. We've got to think of that 12 months of the year. We've got to think about how we educate and so on. And I'll talk a little bit about that when we talk about threats. This is no surprise to you on cyber threats, no surprise to you on the fact that they're happening, increasing, so on and so forth. What's a real surprise to me in this slide is that 77% of businesses lack an incident response plan. Wow. If that is representative of the folks that are here today, I'd suggest you leave now and go and start to build an incident response plan. So critical to be able to respond. And in fact, last week I was in the Maritimes. We were going through a tabletop exercise, testing an incident response plan in front of a board, so that the board could see how complex this is, so that they could see how to respond, how management was going to respond in the event of a breach. And simple questions: do we pay ransomware? Are we allowed to pay ransomware? By the way, you're going to hear from me that, I'm not a big believer in paying ransomware. I know there are times when we have to do it, but I've got this thing that sort of bothers me about paying the criminals. And most surprising about that, about 3 months ago, there was a breach in the US, a ransomware attack against the Sheriff's Department. And the Sheriff's Department paid the ransom. Think about that for a few seconds, how bad that breach was, that a Sheriff's Department paid ransom. Cyber, one of our top 5 things that threats to humanity. Phenomenal that it's there. Unfortunately, it's there, but it certainly gets the attention of our organizations, doesn't it, moving forward? Once again, we need to think of this as a business issue. It's not a cost center. And I like to think of cyber as a team sport, that everybody in that organization, physically or virtually, is playing that team sport, as are our partners that we're dealing with. Because, when we look at some of the massive issues we've had in the last few years, some of the massive attacks have been third-party risk related. And, I've talked to organizations that don't even know all the third parties that they're dealing with. And I can tell you, when I was with the RCMP, locally at the divisional level, there was a lot of leeway at that time in what was deployed from a provincial perspective. And I, at one point, had no idea what we were connected to, and we had to change that. We had to move forward with that. Now we get into some of the fun stuff on the presentation. We're going to talk about different threats that we're facing. And you all know these threats, right? Nothing of surprise here. I still, as a traditionalist, believe that our largest threat is the insider threat. I don't mean necessarily malicious, although malicious can do us a lot of harm, but the insider that does the wrong thing, clicks on the wrong thing, exposes their passwords. Think of COVID when we first sent people home, working on common devices that were shared by the family, potentially by neighbors or neighbors' kids, so on and so forth. We've got to worry about that. One thing that I was really focused on in previous jobs, obviously the threat, but I was really worried about the corruption of data. Somebody coming in and modifying data without us knowing it. And think of, in the RCMP example, criminality databases, analytics, information that's being used for prosecution purposes and corrupting that data. You're not sending people to jail. You're maybe releasing people before they should be released. You're losing sight of the bad people that want to do us harm. So really, really worried about corruption of data. Loss of life sounds somewhat dramatic, but we are seeing a lot of hacks against medical devices, hacks against hospitals, and think about hacks against 911 systems. Think about hacks that impede police from responding to calls or responding with the wrong information. There are numerous cases out there where police, unfortunately, have been killed, where they did not have the information going into that call. And that we just can't allow those sorts of things to happen. Let's talk a little bit about the actors, the vectors, the motivation, and impact, because this is really, really important. We need to know for our vertical what are the biggest threats to our organization. So give you the example of, and we were just talking about police forces. When there's a negative interaction with the police force and citizens, and that usually means shooting somebody, a police officer involved in a fatal shooting, we see a lot of hacktivism against a police force. We see denial of service against a police force. We see defacing of websites at police forces. So they're particularly concerned about that sort of thing, denial of service, so on and so forth. If you're in the critical infrastructure business, if you're in power generation, if you're in a utility, we'd be very, very concerned potentially about denial of service, about foreign actors coming in and shutting us down. And if you look at the precursor to the Russian-Ukrainian war, the activities of the Russians, sensing, probing, disrupting, it was really obvious that ground forces were going to come in soon enough. I'm going to just talk about state-sponsored for a second because it's, I think, really important. And, when I started my career 30-some years ago, in the intelligence community, I know you guys from Alberta are saying, Ottawa intelligence, it's a little bit of a misnomer, but nevertheless, within the intelligence community in Ottawa, we didn't read about that stuff. Right? You didn't get a sense of what was going on. You weren't getting a sense of what the Russians were up to, disinformation, so on and so forth. Today is front page news. We're reading about it all the time. So I'm going to talk briefly to what I view as the top 3 foreign state-sponsored threats that we Canadians have to worry about. I'll talk about the North Koreans to begin with. What do you think? How much cryptocurrency do you think they stole last year? North Korea, the country, because everything is tied to the state in North Korea. They stole $1.7 billion of cryptocurrency. It's a big deal for the North Koreans. Half of the foreign funds coming into North Korea were achieved through cyber attack. Think about that for a second, and think about what they're up to. They're after money. It's as simple as that. We're helping to feed their economy, we're helping them to buy arms, and now they're selling arms to the Russians. So think about what they're doing when they attack and steal from us. Now, like, if we take a look at the Russians are all about instant gratification. There is no separation between state, academics, and in a lot of cases, organized crime. So they're out looking for a buck as well. They're also out disrupting, as we see Ukraine, as we've seen in Estonia, as we've seen in Canada. They're disrupting, they're doing those sorts of things. But the Russians are really looking to tomorrow. And what are their goals for tomorrow? What are their goals for next week? Then if we look at the Chinese threat, these Chinese are absolutely surgical in what they're doing. They are probing, they are hacking, they are trying to get in. They're not necessarily after funds, they're not necessarily after money. They're about stealing technology, stealing intellectual property, but more importantly, getting into our critical infrastructure, getting into other areas, and ready to pounce. So those are the types of foreign threats we need to worry about, state-sponsored threats we need to worry about. And as we worry about those, what helps us to achieve our organizational goals? It's our cyber program. It's the ability to defend, the ability to respond, the ability to threat hunt, see who's in and who's on our network. And as I said, I wasn't going to speak to the complete slides because time won't allow for that, but more than happy to, as I say, share these with you. But also, if you don't agree with what I'm saying, if you don't agree with some of the points that I'm making, more than happy to have that dialogue with you at another time. So, why do we want to validate our cyber program? We need to know where we are. When I go into an organization that I don't know, the first thing I ask is, how are you doing from a cyber perspective? If you can't express that in 30 seconds or less, you don't know, or you're not sure. And we need to work on that. Second question I'll ask is, what's your ability to respond? Because once again, it's so important to be able to respond to threats. So you want to set the bar of where you are. Just as importantly, you want to establish where you want to take the cyber program, because very few organizations have it where they want it to be. And when they get it to where they want it to be, it's a tough slog to keep it there, because the threats are evolving and changing around us. What are you going to look like? What are you going to look for from an assessment perspective? You're going to look at equipment, you're going to look at people, you're going to look at process, you're going to look at all of these sorts of things. And, when we look at a lot of the big breaches over time, and I'll talk about the intelligence community, everybody's heard of Edward Snowden, right? His big deal was people trusted him. He was in a secure environment. They shared passwords with him. And then he ran away and did a lot of harm, not just to the U.S., but to Canada, to our allies, so on and so forth. And we can have that conversation. Was Snowden a hero or a villain? My view of that is, if he was a hero, he wouldn't be in Russia today. If he was a hero, he'd be back in the U.S. So we need to think about that. We've had our own Snowdens here in Canada, by the way. We've had those types of breaches as well. Submariner Delisle on the East Coast, working for Maritime Command, and others. You want a model against which you're going to measure your program. So as an example, I'm putting up the capability maturity model. You're going to rate your program on a scale of 1 to 5. When I look at this model, most organizations are sitting between a 2 and a 3. Typically, you're not going to be up at a 5. You're going to be in the 2 to 3 range. You're going to decide where you want to be, but you're going to communicate it. And once again, if we look at our strategy, our business objectives and threats, we want to find and we want to assess ourselves taking all of those things into account. And when you look at roadmap themes, and I know I'm hurrying up a little bit now because I got the indication that tells me it's time to get off soon, but you're going to look at your strategy, innovation, governance, security operations, incident response, so on. Don't minimize the value of governance. Don't minimize the value of knowing everybody's responsibility within the organization as it relates to the cyber program, as it relates to moving it forward, so on and so forth. And with that, thank you for your time. I know this is the toughest time of the day to present right after lunch. I'm going to hand it over to Ian to talk about Zero Trust, and then I believe we're both going to be here for Q&A at the end of our talks. So, over to you.
Hey everyone. Don't worry, I'm not going to sing Copacabana. That was a different presentation that I did. So anyways, thank you everyone for attending today's call. Like Michael said, it's after lunch, so let's have a bit of fun. I am drinking water. It's white, it's not vodka. So one of the things about Zero Trust is it's something that it's so widespread in the industry where, different vendors, different analysts, they all talk about it, right? If you're an up and coming, student of cybersecurity starting your journey, I just wanted you guys to be aware that we have resources out there that's only slightly biased, vendor tainted. But, if you wanted to learn more about what Zero Trust is, there is a book that I would strongly recommend. It's free, ebook called 7 Elements of a Highly Successful Zero Trust Architecture. And again, if you're thinking of, upping your resume with things like certification, I believe we have the only Zero Trust certification out there. It's called Zero Trust Certified Architect. So definitely have a look. Lots of good content. So a lot of the content that I'll be presenting today is related to some of the elements here. Now, let's pause and think a bit. What are we trying to achieve with Zero Trust, right? If you think about in the old days when people had yellow pages, that big honking book where you could, publicize your phone numbers, right? I see some of my colleagues here, they've used it to, call people they shouldn't call, stalk people they shouldn't stalk. Facebook is much better for that now. But the whole idea here is that, you could have a caller, in this case, I believe his name is Chris, calling a particular user Amy, and then he'll be connected, right? And the problem with that, with publishing your applications, making sure that you're reachable, is that anybody can call you, right? The whole concept of Zero Trust is that the fact that people who don't want to call you have the ability to call you presents itself as a risk. So if you now move that analogy to something more IT related or networking related, you could think about how your users are accessing your applications today, right? Most organizations post-COVID have some kind of hybrid workforce strategy, where 3 days in the office, 2 days in the office, full-time remote, unless you're oil and gas, maybe it's 5 days in the office. But regardless, from a remote access perspective, this is sort of the same, where the VPN concentrator is always saying, connect to me, right? Now, let's think about the art of the possible a little bit. Let's say if we have in the middle the ability to have, something like an intelligent switchboard. So first and foremost, Amy, the users here, the phone number is not published, okay? You can't call her, but you know how to reach her to an intermediary. Right, so for example, in this case, Chris again tries to call Amy. It goes to an intermediary, and then if you authorize, you can have a 1 hour call with Amy. Now, if you're an unwanted caller, right, you call the intermediary, you're not authorized, you don't have access to Amy. Here, the example we use is, a smart switchboard. Back in my time, this would be Amy's dad. So, same concept, but in a more technical term. So from a technical perspective, we do have that kind of ability as well with a concept, I'm going to elaborate on this a bit more, called the Zero Trust Exchange, right? Bringing something conceptual to something tangible. But the idea is very, easy to relate to. Before you connect to your applications which are hidden, you go through a broker. If you authorize, you get access. If you don't have authorized, then you're out of luck. Now let's use a slightly different analogy just to really compare and contrast, legacy network security architecture with Zero Trust, right? If we don't take the opportunity to transform how we do things, then we're basically, putting lipstick on a pig, modifying what we have existing to fit a new paradigm, and that tends not to work too well. So think about it, if let's say you're going to a building and you wanted to access a particular room. Let's say you're here for an interview, all right? You go to see the receptionist, you're given a pass, and then she points to you, that's at room 22. The issue here is that in this loose scenario, the user has the ability to go to the building and explore. Maybe he's looking for the washroom. Maybe he got lost. Maybe it's malicious. You don't know, right? Some of the doors to their offices may be locked. All right, so you have some security. But the fact that the user has the ability to snoop around either maliciously or accidentally presents itself as a risk. Okay? So again, same analogy with VPN. Now let's modify this a bit. I watch way too much movies, so pardon me for this reference, but let's say you want to go to a club, a very nice club. You don't know where it is, but you know you want to go to it. To go to that club, you need to meet a certain guy at a meet me point. He authorized you, rather you paid the money. He then blindfolds you, put you in the car, drive you to the club, drop you off, take off your blindfold, do what you need to do, and on the way back, blindfolds you and put you in the car and bring you back to the meet me point. It is kind of gangster, I get it, but it is really safe that way, right? So this is another way of approaching, how do we secure our critical applications, right? It is important to us, our data are important to us. Same concept with the zero trust exchange, right? So the whole idea here is not moving things laterally. Now, all right, so if let's say we buy into this whole additional security, the security paradigm with zero trust, now what's the best way of delivering it though, right? So think about it. Today, you're not only thinking about your applications that resides in your physical data center, they could be in the cloud, any cloud. Think about where your data is located. They could be in all kinds of SaaS applications. They could be in corporate sanctioned and sometimes unsanctioned applications as well. These are some of the key things you need to think about when you're thinking, how do I implement zero trust? These days, we usually think about employees as somebody we need to protect access to those applications, but more and more organizations are going through mergers and acquisitions, partnering up with contractors where you might not have the ability to put them on corporate devices. And let's not forget our future masters, artificial intelligence, IoT, headless device. We need to account for that as well because you want something holistic. Pre-COVID, post-COVID, doesn't matter. The reality is a lot of people are working from home. Some people are working in the office. I had the pleasure of working in the office for many, many years at Telus. Do not regret it. It was a lot of fun, as well as people in the branches. So one approach, just to think about it, is having an agent-based approach, right? Sort of makes sense if you think about it. But let's fast forward a couple of years. When you go with an agent-based approach, you're installing a software on a device. Typically, it works well the first year, second year, because it's limited in functionality. As customer demands increases, corporations, vendors, add more features, the software gets larger. It's just natural progression. And then with even more customer demands, it's going to be supported on more operating systems, more security functions, and there's always that risk of it impacting your other systems. That's just the nature of the beast. Now, if we look at classical way of how do we secure users, it's traditionally through a network firewall of some kind. Makes sense, right? I used to sell firewalls, made decent money selling it. But when your users are everywhere all at once, it's not something tangible. Now, if only if we could, like the old ball and chain, carry it anywhere with you, then perhaps this is something that you could go. Apologies to married couples here. AI chose that image, really. This was what I was going for. So, it is not tenable to bring your security with you, right? So, what are we left? We're left with something hard to do, but something, if it's done correctly, has the ability to do all this, right? So when we talk about agent before, the problem arises because you keep on adding functionality, it becomes complex. And then when we talk about a security appliance, it's great, but you can't bring it everywhere. So here's sort of a best of both worlds where all the security functions are done in the cloud, right? I mean, I'm sure a CIO would like it. They're spending so much money on all these hyperscalers. So why not security? If we have security configured and done in the cloud, what that gives you as a customer or an employee or users is that as you add complexity and services, it does not impact users. All we need to figure out what to do is how to send traffic to the cloud, right? So if you've been following folks like Gartner and Forrester and all those guys, this is the whole concept of SASE or SSE or whatever new name they come up with, right? Where at first, initially, to be honest, when I first saw this, it didn't quite make sense. Maybe because I'm not employed by a cloud delivered company, it makes sense. But really, if you think about it, having services done in the cloud make a lot of sense. With this way, you have everything, everyone, everywhere, secured all at once. It can be done. Now, this is way too much text, but really, so we've talked about what we want from a zero trust architecture. We talked about what's of the potential best way of delivering it, but what does it do for you, right? So we can verify, control, and enforce. So too much words, but let me give you walk through an example, and then I'll pretty much end the talk. Now let's talk about Amy again. Amy's a queen because she's in HR. Now, if you start thinking about, wait a minute, what's her IP address, or creating policy related to IP address, I think you've lost the plot, right? Because, I mean, if we're going to change things up, let's forget certain old technologies or policies that we used to do. All we really should care about is Amy, who she is, which group she belongs, and what applications she's accessing, right? These applications could be applications that are in your control, in your data center. It could be applications that you have no control at all. It's in the SaaS application of some kind. It could be even personal applications that Amy is trying to access. Really, the conversation is all about how do I get my user connecting to my application. Now, again, if in the access policy you're thinking about IP addresses again, I think you've lost the plot. Now that we know what we want to do, which is connecting the right users to the right applications, we now have the ability to fine-tune things a little bit. Amy on a corporate laptop, you get certain privileges. Amy on your cell phone, less privileges. Amy having vacation in Jamaica, she shouldn't be working, but if she was, a different set of privileges. We could add things like, how clean is Amy's device, right? We could have posture checks, antivirus on, certain certificates, are you domain joined? Again, all these are additional conditions that we can put in place to then monitor and determine how best to deal with Amy. And if Amy has too much to drink, she has maybe really no access to applications. So those are all available. Now, once we connect Amy to an application, let's not stop there. Again, we're talking about zero trust here, or really not trusting as much as possible. In fact, don't trust whatever I'm saying, really, honestly. So the traffic flow between the user and application can and should be inspected, because I think Michael was saying just now about insider threats, right? Whether it's malicious intention or by accident. So the communication between Amy and the application should always be inspected for malware, should always be inspected for data exfiltration. It happens, right? So stop and think for a moment how this is very different from how you've used to provide remote access to your users. And again, this is not static. Assessments should be continuous because people change, things change. I did leave my iPad outside, and who knows what happened. Thanks for keeping it. So, it happens, accidents happen. I mean, that's the reality of it. Now, I've talked a lot about this zero trust model, but if you were to compare and contrast with a lot of industry guidelines, things like Gartner, Forrester, NIST, and so on and so forth, they sort of say the same thing, but maybe using different languages or emphasizing different points. But this really, what I want to impress on you guys is, here's an opportunity to make yourself really a bit more secure in a very new paradigm. I was speaking prior to this with a colleague of mine, different company, where we had a conversation about cyber insurance, right? So MFA was sort of a big topic for a lot of organizations, I think, renewing their cyber insurance this year. If you have a chance to look at some of the questionnaires that cyber insurance companies are giving out for future renewals, they may not explicitly mention zero trust, the term, because it's shrouded with a lot of marketing, but a lot of the elements of it is there. So it's really just a matter of time. Now, to summarize, I mean, if you think about the traditional way we do things, network-based controls, you're really giving the user too much visibility to what's going on. No matter how you implement it, we really should be talking about providing visibility at the right level. And when you do so, if you spot it, you see certain things you wouldn't have seen before. Lastly, this is happening whether you like it or not. Don't follow the way of the ostrich. Now, we're going to be here for the next couple of hours. Hopefully this was informational. Come talk to the Optiv and Zscaler team. We're right out there. I'll send you guys the link to the ebook if you're interested. Just good to read out of what's happening. And if you ever want to get in touch, feel shy to talk to us today, you can get a hold of us, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Michael and Ian, for the wonderful presentation. Any questions? Okay.
My question is to Michael about the structure of the cybersecurity function in organizations. You showed a couple of areas that kind of form the cybersecurity function. I'm interested to know about the reporting structure, the current trends, and your own opinion. Should the CISO report to the CIO, or should they report to the Chief Risk Officer or to the CEO directly? That's one. Number two is about 3 lines of defense. So it's kind of a new trend in management of risk in cybersecurity. Now, there has been kind of a duplication of responsibilities between line 1 mostly and line 2. I saw in one of your slides you showed a governance, risk, and compliance group. Should that group not be part of second line instead of line 1? And what will be the differences between that group, GRC, and line 2, where cybersecurity and IT risk management is owned? Thank you.
Thank you for that question. Great questions, by the way. The answer is yes. Okay, let's first of all talk about the placement of the CISO, the placement of the CIO, and where they fit in the corporate structure. I've seen both the CISO reporting to the CIO and not to the CIO, so I'll start with that one to begin with. And in my 2 CIO jobs, in one case at Corrections, the CISO was reporting to me. At the RCMP, they were reporting elsewhere in the organization. I'm a firm believer that the CISO needs to be heard. The CISO needs to be heard at the highest levels of the organization and has to be able to carry on conversations with ELT. In the case where the CISO reported to me, we created a dotted line to the Commissioner of Corrections so that he could go talk to the Commissioner anytime he was not satisfied that he wasn't getting my attention or the attention of the technical group. So that worked out well. I think that, but you can have either construct. You just have to understand governance and the roles that we play. If I was designing, if we all came together today and we were going to design an organization together, I would not have the CISO reporting the CIO. I just would rather see a different line. The other thing about the CISO is he or she should not be buried down in the organization such that they're not heard. Because once again, what the CISO is reporting to the organization is all about risk. And who better to handle and understand that risk than the leadership of the organization? And the CISO needs to hand that risk to seniors in the organization, so that if they decide they're not going to fund the program, or if they decide they're not going to fund it adequately, or whatever the case may be, they are well aware of that. So does that help from the placement of the CISO? He or she, their voice must be heard. And by the way, I don't ever think that the sky is falling is a good reaction to anything. You know, you have to have the ability to, once again, speak leadership language, but speak it in a risk-based way, and not tell them the sky is falling and we can't do anything about it. I think that just anecdotally is very interesting. You talked first line, second line, so on and so forth. And I think in a lot of organizations, compliance will sit elsewhere. In a lot of organizations, the risk function will sit elsewhere. And you can think of them as the second line of defense, measuring compliance. How are we doing from a compliance perspective? That is typically in another part of the organization. They are typically very involved in communicating to the board, in communicating to the risk committee of the board. So I think the second and third lines of defense are there from, and I'll simplify it to say from an accountability perspective, from a monitoring perspective, from a different voice perspective. And as CIO, you know, when I was at the RCMP, one of my best friends was a head of audit. And, you know, sometimes you want to run away from audit, right? Because they're going to make your life complicated. But we got it to the point where I could go to the chief audit executive and say, you know, I really suck at identity. We're really not doing a good job in identity here at the RCMP. You should probably audit that. You should probably have a look at that, because that's a risk to the organization. Why would I go to the chief audit executive and expose my program that way? Because for some reason I wasn't getting the funding I needed to move the identity program forward. So now I had an audit report that said, you know, you suck at this, and they didn't typically use that language, but you're not good at this, there's a risk for the RCMP, and you've got to get better at it. Then you can help move it forward. So I really, really believe in second, third line of defense. I believe in them from an accountability perspective. And in my talk, I talked a little bit about governance. The governance of those functions, where they reside, is tremendously important. And I'll give you one last example. I'm a risk advisor to a large financial. And part of what I do is advise them on their cyber risk, advise the board on the cyber risk, and so on. And it's really important because for this financial, cyber is a tier 1 risk. So it's got everybody's attention. Now the deal is, what are we doing about it? And how are we moving forward? And all of those players that you mentioned and that you asked in your question have a role to play. Does that help? Perfect. Thank you.
I think we are out of time. If you have any questions, please meet Michael and Ian at their booth. And thank you again for sharing your insights about cyber risk and how Zero Trust can help resolving some of them. As a